Your users don't all speak the same language, and your apps shouldn't force them to. Translation done well is what turns a single market product into a global one. And Azure gives us multiple ways to do it across both text and speech. Hi, I'm Rob Folkrod, a lead technical trainer at Microsoft, and in this session, we'll cover translating text and speech across languages. We'll start with translation in Microsoft Foundry generally. Then we'll look at Azure AI Translator for text and finish with speech translation so we can carry conversation across language boundaries in real time. So let's get started with the session. There are a number of ways of doing translation in Microsoft Foundry. Many of you who know large language models are aware that generative AI is capable of doing translation. As a matter of fact, in the origin story of generative AI, translation was its kind of initial purpose, and we found out it could do much more than that. The problem with using large language models is they do have to be trained very specifically on a large number of languages. And while they have a handful of languages that they do incredibly well, it's not as complete as some of the other tools that are available to us. So here we're going to look at a couple tools that have been designed very specifically for nothing other than translation. We have the Azure Translator inside of Foundry Tools. And then we can stack, when we want spoken language, we can stack Azure Speech over the top of it as well. So we're going to use the Azure Translator, and this is, again, one of the built-in Foundry tools. So we're really not concerned about the underlying model that you're using. As long as it's capable of making MCP calls, we're in pretty good shape. You're first going to note the endpoint that we're going to need at this point. Whatever the name of your Foundry resource is, then .cognitiveservices.azure.com. With the API key or authorization token. In many of our examples, we've been using things like the default Azure credential or the default AZCLI credential, which gives us a token provider. One of those two mechanisms can be used in conjunction with our text translation client. Once we have that client, there's a few important tasks that we want to know about. The first one is the ability to just ask, what languages do we support? So you can call that function, get back a list of the supported languages, and typically what you will see here is that the supported language list will be larger than if you were to use a large language model. Most average large language models, their list of languages that they do well. So get the supported language, get back the codes and the example languages that it knows. Okay. Then there are two important tasks when it comes to translation between languages, in written form specifically. And the first, and probably most obvious, is the translate text. That we have text of language A, and we want to get the equivalent meaning inside of language B, whatever that happens to be. Right? So the second option is understanding that languages have different character sets that are available to them, that they write in different ways. And so there is also what is called transliterate, or transliteration. And transliteration is moving from one system or script to another. Right? We're not getting meaning there, we're just translating into something that for some is like easier to pronounce. Right? We're looking at the pronunciation and writing it in another script, another set of characters. So those are the two calls that we can make using the text translation client. Now, if we were translating speech, we're going to go back to what we saw in our earlier session. Right? Translating speech, we're going to have a different endpoint here. Notice we're calling out to our Foundry resource and services.ai.azure.com. So change up of the endpoint, but we are not changing up what we are allowing in there, API key Microsoft Entra ID. Again, either one of those will work. In the earlier example, we said token. It's the same thing, right? Just some sort of mechanism to grab a token. And then we will need the speech translation config. So the speech translation config is the one that has that connection information. It understands the endpoint. It understands the credential, where we're going. And then we can bring in the translation recognizer, whose job is to do the actual work from the configured resource. Now, when we are using that translation recognizer, we have a couple of different formats. And for a couple of different scenarios. So what you see here on the screen, they talk about event-based or manual synthesis. What we're really looking at is, do we want this to feel more live as we're going? We're getting translation right away. Or are we doing something kind of in bulk? So the event-based is useful when doing one-on-one translations, single language on both sides. So you're going to specify the desired voice that you want in your translation config. And then there is an event that we are listening in for to the receive audio stream. So as an audio stream is coming in, that event kicks off, which then can handle the translation side of things. Manual synthesis is when we're bringing in a text, but we may need to generate multiple outputs, each of different languages. So this may be a bulk operation that we're translating a series of documents, or that we're translating a series of maybe UI elements that we're then supporting many languages kind of statically at the end. Right, so those are the two strategies. Going back to the event-based, the components that we're going to need, that speech translation config is going to know where the server is. The translation recognizer, what is the languages that we are going to be going back and forth on. When the event handler kicks off, we've received some audio, then we can go through that translation and send that to the output config. That output config, in many cases here, is going to be directly to a speaker, right, to be translating that kind of as the data is coming in, but could also be a file. In our more manual process, the manual synthesis option, speech translation config again, translate recognizer in there. Then we're going to bring in the speech, one or more speech configs. What are the languages that we are putting those out to, and hand those to the speech synthesizer. Again, those could go directly to a speaker output. In many cases here, because we do have the ability to do multiple languages side by side, you may be writing those out to file. All right. What I want to do is take an example here. We'll kind of walk through the example of both of those. We'll go through some text translation, then we will take a look at translating speech. And this doesn't require us to have deployed any models at this point in time. However, I'll click on the build and I'll click on the models section. But instead of going into any particular model, we will dive into the AI services component. And from there, we have what used to be called the cognitive services, or the Azure AI services here. And we can use, for example, the text translation. So we dig into text translation, and we could do kind of our standard hello world. I do miss my colleagues around who are good with lots of different languages. I am not, so kind of stuck with me here for a minute. But let's pick French. Here we go, and just do a quick little translation there. Bonjour le monde. So it's a good start, right? And that's fine here inside of our Foundry. A minor note here, if we go take a look at the code section here, you'll see our endpoint, and we're using what looks like the kind of the older cognitive services endpoint. That's fine. I'm going to throw that onto the clipboard for later. And let's take a look at what this would look like in code. So first things first, always drop our endpoints into our environment variables so that we have those, and save. So basically just our project resource, cognitiveservices.azure.com. If we look at our requirements here, we're bringing in Azure Cognitive Services and Azure AI Translate. And let's do the text side of things first. If we jump in, we're bringing in Azure AI Translation, right? Our text, importing the vast majority of the namespace there, and our text translation client. Right, so this is the crux of the whole thing. It gets our credential, which we have seen many times before, and our endpoint. Okay. Then the first thing we're doing is we're asking the client, hey, what languages are supported, specifically for translation, as opposed to, we talked briefly earlier about transliteration. We're specifically looking at translation at this point in time. And then we are asking for a target language. Now, if we look at the list of languages that we are supporting, right, we've got that list right here, and it will be asking us for the 2-letter code for what language we want to be working with here. And the block itself, and will continue to ask us until we pick one that is inside of the list. So we look, if it's in there, supported language, great, we can move on. Otherwise, we're stuck in a loop until we get it right. All right. But then we say, okay, input text, the text that we would like to translate into that particular language. Right. All right, so let's give this a run. And in there, let's do Python and translate text for starters. All right, 137 languages supported at this point in time. We've got that same link right there. Enter a target language. And let's translate things to French. And this is a test. Save and test. Pardon me, folks who speak French. Hasn't been for a very, very long time, and I was never good at it. But there we are. So whatever we're putting in here, okay, there we are in our translations. Right. So pretty straightforward process here. Looking at the translation, I probably didn't, as I was pointing this out, point out the main method in this case here. But the main method we're looking at is the translate method. Right. In the translate, we're using that same client we just created up above in that translate method, passing in the elements there and the target language. Now, there's other parameters that you can include in there. The from language, if we didn't want it to auto detect, you saw that when I was typing in English, it just picked up on the fact that it was in English. If there were enough similarities, you could say, listen, here is the from language if we wanted. If there was profanity involved, what did we want to do with that profanity? Those types of things could be included in the translate. Then we get the response, and then if there's something in there, we are popping up the response, source language, and what it was translated to. Right. All right. Let's quit. And then take a look at speech. Now, speech obviously is going to be a little bit more involved, and this is going to layer on top of a lot of the components that we saw earlier when we were talking about speech to text, because as we saw earlier in our earlier conversation, we are really relying on those underlying components and then layering translation on top of it. So we're bringing in the Azure Cognitive Services Speech SDK. inside of the speech SDK, we're bringing in a translation and a speech translation configuration and passing in the where and the how, right? What is our credential? Where are we going? Then to that configuration, we're specifying what the recognition language is. So I will be speaking in English US, and then the target languages, right? We will have French, Spanish, and Hindi in there. Then we have our audio configurations. You may recall that we have to say, well, where are we bringing this information from? In this case, pretty straightforward. We're going to use the default microphone, the same thing I'm using to record this right now. And so the translator is then going to be given the translation configuration up above and audio in. That's going to be our input side of things. Okay. Then it's going to say ready, and we'll go from there. Then on the speech configuration, so this is in essence the output side of things. We'll have a speech config, same credential, same endpoint, and we will have an audio out. In this case, we'll use the default speaker, okay? And we will devise 3 different voices that are going to be used. And then it waits. So here we have our recognize once, so that'll be waiting for me on the microphone until there's a long enough pause. Okay. We'll go through the translation process to understand what I have. That'll kind of read what I have. And then for each one of the languages, we will go through and do another configuration. We'll go grab the particular voice. We'll set the output side of things and then use the speech synthesizer to do the speech configuration and the output. And then finally, the method that's going to pull it all together, the speak method. So if this goes well, we'll do a little Python, translate speech. Welcome, my friends. I hope this goes well.
Bienvenue mes amis, j'espère que tout se passera bien.
Bienvenidos, amigos, espero que todo vaya bien.
मेरे दोस्तों का स्वागत है, मुझे आशा है कि यह अच्छी तरह से होगा.
And there we are. So we have a nice little example of both being able to do kind of translation of text and to be able to do the listening to speech and translation. All right, folks, let's wrap this up. So let's take a look at what we remember here. What function of an Azure Translator text translation client object should you use to convert the Chinese word to the English word hello? Continuing with that thought, what function of an Azure Translator text translation client object should we use if we wanted to convert the Russian word into Cyrillic characters? And that's going to be the transliterate option. And then finally, which Azure Speech SDK object should you use to specify the languages in which you wanted speech translated? Right, and that's the speech translation config. So here we've taken a look at making our applications much more multilingual. We've taken a look at the Azure Translator for both text and document translation. We saw the capability of transliteration and worked through the SDK, both configuring the speech translation configuration object and looking at the 2 different strategies that we might have, event-based, good for more real-time translation, and the manual synthesis, much more helpful when we need to use multiple languages as our output. In this session, we made our solutions multilingual. We enhanced our application using Azure AI Translator for text and speech translation. And that wraps topic 3. Look at what we've built. We taught apps and agents to read text with the language service and its complement MCP server. We gave them a voice with multimodal audio chat and the speech service, all the way to real-time conversation with Voice Live, and helped them bridge across multiple languages with translation. That's the complete language and speech skill set. Your apps and agents can now read, listen, speak, and translate. And that's a huge step on how we naturally can interact with people. I encourage you to remain curious and continue exploring new capabilities. That's how we'll all stay relevant. There are many ways to continue your learning journey, and I invite you to search for your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.